revolution, competing theories of revolution. We have read on modernization and revolution, and this week we have read on economic development and revolution. And since you were in the command center of the Iranian economy, did you see it coming?
Yeah. As I was listening to your introductory remarks, Dr. Tavakoli, I thought you were just about to say that here is the cause of the Iranian Revolution. The fact of the matter is I had nothing to do with it, but I'm here to explore with you what happened, if you like. And here, being in the Department of History and dealing with civilizations, I think it's fair to ask that in history as a discipline, we always look at an event, it's taken place. The fact of the matter is that on February 11, 1979, there was a revolution in Iran of worldwide significance, the implications of which and the consequences thereof we are still living in. With that in mind, obviously, as yourselves, as students of history, you ask what happened? What were the causes of revolution? By definition, therefore, I am subject to correction. History is ex post. Something has happened, you look backwards. But I'd like to take you for a moment back to 1978, a year before the revolution in Iran. If you were then, I don't suppose you were then living some 36 years ago.
A few exceptions.
Few exceptions. If you were looking at the Middle Eastern geography and a map of the Middle East, and you said to yourself, now let me look, which of these countries are most prone or most likely for a revolution of this dimension to happen? And let us suppose for a moment that, again, you as a person had read Thomas Walton's article. And you try to translate all the analysis that is done very, in my view, quite competently. And being very close to the revolution, I chose that in particular so that we would not have the benefit of the hindsight too much. And being a scholar, if you were to translate all his criteria as indications of a revolution, in summary, just to summarize what you must have read already, he puts a lot of emphasis on industrial policy of Iran. Clearly, he says it has something to do with it. He puts a lot of emphasis on Gini's coefficient, income distribution. He puts emphasis on urbanization. Urbanization without employment, a very significant qualifying feature of it, certainly in the later years. He also talks about neglect of agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, he talks about corruption. He talks about dictatorial political system in the context of those economic managements. Now, if we were to use these, and a couple of others if you can think of, in economic terms, in particular inflation, you may recall he put some emphasis on inflation. Now we are looking at the map of the Middle East 1978, and we are using our criteria with scientific knowledge, perfect data availability. We can do the same tests in every country in the Middle East. Which would you say would have been the most likely country to have a revolution, not only to have a revolution, but the significance of the total, almost total uprising of a nation? At least this is how the academia have analyzed the situation. It was the entire society, as they say, against the ruler. with a rapid acceleration of the events in the last dying weeks or months. And the consequences that we have seen. I would like to think that Iran most likely, in the greatest scholarship of minds of the time in 1978, would not have been a candidate. If you look around you at that time, Saddam was in Iraq. It took a US Army with a combination of allies from all over the world to topple him. Pure physical military invasion. The Saudis are still there in the same family.
I thought there will be a revolution there.
The Hafiz Assad's son is still fighting. He's not out of the country yet, but it's still the same system. The Hashemites are in Jordan. And I can go on. And even in the light of the Arab Spring, you would find, looking back to Tunisia, it took saying a no to someone who was literally, arbitrarily trying to stop a guy selling some sabzi. In that environment, my own feeling is that it would be, we would be missing a lot of, large part of the story of the revolution if we emphasized the economics of it. That is to say that all these countries that I mentioned to you, regardless of their political system, which somehow resembled the arbitrary rule, as we read in the literature, as is assigned to Iran, they had huge income disparities. They still do. They had a fair amount of corruption. At least they're known for it. Inflation has been a problem in most of these countries. Industrialization had to be capital intensive in one fashion or another in almost all of these countries. And they're also very much dependent on food imports. So with that as a background, while it's very important, and I think it's relevant, because as I said, we look back in history to find reasons, and whatever deviates from the main course may well be a reason for the revolution. And have a good session on economics, and I'd like to share with you later on, how you feel about it. Clearly, it takes a combination of many factors, certainly including economics, but one would not be able to explain the dimensions and the intensity of that anger at the end, and the mass uprising in economic terms. There are many countries, including Iran of today, facing the same set of economic indicators. I don't believe, and I don't have evidence to support what I claim, my claim, that income disparity has now narrowed down. I don't believe that the top 10% of the population now only earn 10% of the income or the wealth of the country. Inflation is over 40%. They had a new government in Iran, partly, as I understand it, in response to the failure of economic policies of the previous administration. And the corruption, I think, again, I don't wish to comment on it because I don't have any evidence, but one reads the papers and you find that it's well beyond, in fact, the borders of Iran. So, with this evidence, we still have to answer, of course, as students of history, what happened in Iran, which was so unique to Iran, perhaps, what combination of factors and in what sequencing happened which brought about such a dynamic change. And here I also look, again as a student of history, like yourselves, for what are where is the continuity in all this? Is there anything in Iran of today which links Iran of 35 or 40 years ago? What are the common elements of some of the countries I mentioned to you that would provide the type of features that one could think that perhaps something similar could happen in the future, or one could explain their economic policies at least in the same manner as one would have done for the 1960s and the 70s when I had the pleasure of working in Iran. Well, I'd like to suggest to you the following. I want to make sure I get the date right. Yeah. We have many historical markers in our history. I'm sure Professor Tavakoli has touched on many of them, and you're familiar. If you ask an Iranian about 28 Mordad, 19th of August, you ask when was the Constitutional Revolution, they all come out with the right years and the dates. The funny thing is that there is one day in Iranian history that at least you have to look up specialized books to know what it is. And I tell you what that is. It is May 26, 1908. And according to a gentleman called Lieutenant Arnold Wilson, an Indian Army officer in charge of 20 Bengali Lancers, that's how it happened. I saw it rose 50 feet above the top of the rig. On that day, not in Tehran, which is often the main seat of revolutions and revolts in Iran, in a remote place, in the temperature of 110 Fahrenheit, I think people in Toronto would have envied that. Lovely. At 4 a.m., in the depths of 1,110 feet below the treeless ancient Masjid Suleiman, oil was discovered in Iran. I want to translate that to you in economic jargons in a minute. But if you miss the story of oil, you miss the story of economics. You also miss the story of politics of Iran. And in the process, you're also not going to understand the history of Iran. What is it about oil which is so defining, in my views, in terms of economics, politics, and history? Well, in economic terms, the oil money has no matching counter-productive side in the economy. It is like, and it is in fact, totally a wealth rather than an income. And I'll explain that in a minute. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. But in my language, what it means is that if you sell something for $2, which was the price of oil when I joined the Iranian government, or at $12 at the time of the 1973-74 price increases, there is no match in terms of production cost. In my time was about 7 cents. Something generated about 7 cents of cost or income, if you like, inside the country, and you sold it at $2. Remember, now we are talking about $100 per barrel. And in production, just to put the perspective on it. 5 million, and my time it had reached 6 million. Saudis produce 9 million, sometimes 10 million. In today's Iran, we are talking about 2.2 million barrels per day. Now you multiply that by $100, multiply that by 365 days, and you get an enormous amount. Mr. Ahmadinejad, during his 8 years of administration, had command over $700 billion of oil. In order to have that kind of an income, in my estimation at 3% return, if I'm not mistaken, you would have to have something like $63 trillion in order to generate equivalent of 5 million barrels a day at $100 per day. At $100 per barrel, sorry. Now, when you have that kind of wealth, so if you want to go to a high populated oil producing or oil exporting country in the Middle East, you want to know about their economy and what happened to them. Ask them a simple question. What did you do with the oil money? And you'll get the answer right, if they answered you truthfully. And this is that continuing element in our history and in our economics. What did we do with the oil money? If you look at Thomas Walton's narrative, as you have, the story of Iran, he splits it into different periods. Partly in planned periods, partly in the decades. But clearly, he talks about 1962 to 73, what we call the golden economic age of Iran. He talks about 73 to 78. That's when I got my promotions. When things went wrong. Now what happened? I tell you what happened. During the 60s, oil income went up gradually. In the 70s, it jumped up. Why does it matter? Because the amount of oil income that you inject into the economy is the determinant factor of what happens to that economy, because as I mentioned to you, there is no counterbalance inside the economy. So it's like, as that happens